Welcome, everybody, to the webinar series, Incident Response for OT Environments. In the third module, we're going to talk about how to do incident response effectively and how to be prepared. So, a few housekeeping items. Of course, after this presentation, we're going to provide you with the slides. We welcome your questions, and this call will be recorded. So, in any event, I'm Hussein Virani. I am a senior industrial incident responder here at Dragos, and welcome to today's webinar. And so we have a few housekeeping items. As I mentioned previously, the session is being recorded and the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Your lines have been muted, but we still want you to interact with us. So please use the question and answer chat in order to submit any questions you have throughout the course of this presentation. If you're unable to get your question answered during the webinar, we're more than happy to follow up with you afterwards. So I'm Hussein Virani, once again, Senior Industrial Incident Responder. I'm based up in Calgary, Canada, and I hail from law enforcement investigations, but for the past 10 years, my footing has been in the oil and gas sector here up in Calgary. And I've functioned as an investigator and a forensic analyst. Over to Noah.
Yes, and I'm also a senior industrial incident responder here at Dragos. I'm based in the US, South Carolina specifically. Around 6 years of experience with threat operations and incident response with OT cybersecurity. Mainly my sector is hydroelectric and lock and dam. Back to you, Hussein.
Thanks, Noah. Okay, so let's recap our three-part series. The first webinar was you're not alone when it comes to OT security. Dragos is here to help. We prefer to be in a helping position rather than an response position. And so we covered things like the 5 critical controls for effective OT cybersecurity and why it's important to have an incident response plan, not just for IT, but also one very specific to OT. In the second webinar, which was on March 1st, we talked about how OT-IR is different. And we compared and contrasted the difference between OT incident response and IT incident response. We also covered topics like incident management and best practice in order to collect incident response data in an OT environment. So for today, we are going to cover 3 things. And of course, it's all about preparation in order to be effective as incident response. We're going to talk about the OT incident response process in depth. We're going to talk about incident management tools and techniques. And we're also going to cover off incident response checklists. So just to quickly recap, these are the links for the incident response webinars that have happened in the past. And you're going to see the links for both of these dropped into the chat. And so, of course, just to recap, we have our bullet points here and whatnot, but the main thing is that these 3 series are kind of building up to this one that's happening today. So we have a lot of good resources, and Noah's going to tell you about a few of them. Go ahead.
No, one thing I'm going to highlight is that Executive's Guide to OT Cyber Incident Response. It's a white paper that we released, and it really highlights the key difference maker between IT and OT, and it's the risk. How do we handle the risk? Essentially, OT is IT plus physics. And that identifying that risk, you kind of realize the different approaches that we have to take when performing incident response in OT. And that approach can change how we collect evidence, how we triage systems, and how understanding what abnormal looks like in an OT environment. As well as that white paper, we have many more resources on our Dragos websites from the ICS interested APT groups that we track, as well as grab bag incident response content lists. So you can build out your grab bag today and other numerous webinars and white papers.
Yep, exactly. And the latest white paper that's come out is, of course, the Incident Response for Operational Technology white paper, where it goes into, the differences, the considerations to take into account, and really just the basics. So if you're faced with having to build out an OT incident response program, then this is a great place to start. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the white paper. So it was released on the 1st of March, and it talks about OT IT convergence, and it talks about why it's different, and of course, how to prepare for it. A lot of folks tend to focus on IT incident response, but that tends to focus upon confidentiality and integrity, whereas OT incident response is availability and safety. And so we go into a lot of detail within the white paper itself. So let's talk a little bit about the OT incident response process. So as you can see on the left-hand side, there are 3 key groups. Well, 2 really, but 1 joint activity. So you have your incident response team, and then you have your OT operators. We like to call them plant champions. And so through the entire life cycle, you prepare, you identify as the IR team, and then you contain, eradicate, recover, and then jointly do the lessons learned. But it pretty much comes down to 3 different concepts. 1, your IT incident response workflow needs OT consideration. That may live in a separate incident response plan, or it may be part of the IT one. Ownership of containing, eradicating, and recovering in an OT environment typically rests with your plant champions and OT operators. Why is this so? Safety is a consideration. Localized knowledge of the specific technology stack inside of an OT environment also needs to be taken into consideration. And with OT environments, finally, containment and eradication might be continuous due to the presence of things like legacy systems, older portions of firmware. In the previous webinar, my good friend and esteemed colleague, Vernon McCandlish, said he still keeps track of when he sees Windows XP in the environment. And so legacy is definitely something that, as OT responders, we contend with on a regular basis. So how does this roll out? So the threat actor typically gets in through layer 4 or level 4, which is the IT environment. So a number that I throw around quite frequently is that 70% of incursions and breaches happen in the IT environment. The 3.5 level, the MZ gets compromised, and then the threat group laterally moves into levels 2 and 3, which is plant access. So when we start to get into contain, eradication, and recovery, a lot of care has to be given to each and every system that the threat actor happened to go through. As you can see right here, you can see that it came in via a phishing email. They compromised the VPN. They started to laterally move through the DMZ hosts and such, and eventually arrived at the plant level and went into a human machine interface, or an HMI. And of course, once you start to eradicate and such, then obviously you've evicted the threat group. So back over.
Yeah, the OT-IR eradication process, it's unique in terms of when you look at it from IT to OT, and the fact that it is very much a continuous process. And like we mentioned in the previous slide, this is owned by the plant champions in the OT networks. One thing you want to consider, especially within OT, is when you're isolating those networks, you need to consider process safety and other operational impacts that's happening in the environment. And that's usually at the advice of those OT or plant champions. Another thing to understand too, when you're isolating affected systems, sometimes the best practice is to isolate and just rebuild from a known good backups. Now, the reason being, instead of, from an IT standpoint, you would just remove malware, persistent mechanisms that the adversary put in place. The idea of rebuilding from a known good backup and just scanning that known good backup is the consideration of assurance and qualification requirements that's put on that system. So when you have a vendor that comes in and installs that system into the customer's environment, it's certified. Now, if you change that baseline in any kind of way, installing an agent, running a program without the vendor's permission, you could decertify that system and cause a whole heck of a lot more heartache to that client as in a traditional IT environment. So that's why it's always recommended to rebuild from known good backups instead of just removing the malware. Another thing is that account resets. Now, that's why we put kind of 2 asterisks on this, because you got to be very careful when resetting account passwords in an OT environment, because there's many considerations such as shift change. Maybe the next shift can't do their job. That's probably a commonly used account across maybe 3 8-hour shifts. Maybe there's more rotations that you have to consider. And likely you're going to need to contact that vendor to reset all the accounts, especially the system accounts for that SCADA system. Now, to kind of recap, this is kind of a broad overview of those collection data sets for OT. Things that you might be familiar with as a seasoned DFIR expert is that network, maybe disk, and then even memory. Now, things that are new in OT is obviously those ICS protocols and the network vantage point, but the bigger one is that top right quadrant, the process. Understanding the process is very key when performing OT incident response, because you want to understand that series of events, maybe that open and close valve, maybe that upload logic, download logic, anything you can get from historian, because it is pretty much the recorder of all events in the environment. And most importantly is those operator logs. Understanding the initial symptoms of the events that happened upon, hey, the operator raises their hand, says there's something wrong here. Let me annotate this, or maybe there's this change in set points that wasn't authorized, and then the operator records it in their logs. So these are some excellent resources in the OT environment to gather and consider when developing your plan going forward.
Yep, fully agreed. No, and logs are so important. As incident responders, it's almost the first question that ever comes when an incident occurs. It's like, do you have these logs for us? And so taking into account every single log entry in the environment is utterly vital, especially with OT in general, because OT devices tend to have very short log buffers. But one thing I do want to draw in this slide itself is that network data is the most volatile, where it can literally vanish within minutes or even within seconds in some case. And so making sure that you have things like NetFlow fully captured, I can't emphasize how important that is.
That brings us to the collection management framework. This is something that we preach at Dragos, because it's essentially taking all of those collection points or those data sets that I mentioned in the previous slide and making a framework out of it so you can look at it constructively and plan accordingly. So obviously it's gathering all digital assets, all, PLCs, anything that has a log, you want to put it on that CMF. Now you can start building this CMF out, and we'll talk about it in a later slide, to start including relevant threat detection and kind of see where's your coverage. Now, in the case of crash override, do you have all the necessary data sets to answer questions if you were compromised by this malware? And we'll explain it in greater detail in a later slide. Now, creating a CMF, let's start with, the top level device, right? We're going to talk about that VPN appliance, right? We're looking at authentication logs. It's 30 days. It's in the IT SIEM though, so it can be a little easier to access that. Now we go to the jump host, right? That DMZ. This is where we kind of see that lateral movement pivoting from the adversary, from the layer 4 to that 3.5 DMZ. Now on that jump host, there might be an EDR appliance because it's still considered an IT system and managed by maybe the cybersecurity. So they were able to put an EDR agent on that system. Now that's 10 days of storage, but now that's being routed to the OT SIEM. That's why it's 10 days now. It may be a little harder to get access because you may need different creds to access that instance. Then moving into a network management appliance, right? DHCP, that goes back almost to a year. It may be provided by if you have the Dragos platform or another appliance. And it kind of gives you that history of P assignments to Mac. Then moving into the plant area network, we talk about that engineering workstation. Maybe you have Sysmon gathering event logs from that system. But once again, if it's local to the system, it may be a day or possibly a year, given the compression algorithm that's used. And of course, if you're aggregating this all to a log server, it is the best. And then, of course, we have our lowest level devices, that kind of that process layer or Purdue level 1 and 0, where you kind of have that SIS, that safety instrumented system controller, right? It's going to protect that process from reaching a kind of a limiter. It's like a fuse. Now, one thing to note with this is it's passive network data. It's in the Dragos, if you have the Dragos platform, it's capturing it and it goes back a year. And then the lowest level, a PLC, it's probably producing a syslog type. It's getting, maybe it can be exported, maybe it's not, but that's something that we need to answer. And that's why the CMF is such a valuable tool to kind of map your coverage, and then you could start layering in threat detection or TTPs by the adversary on top of all these. And to kind of recap, you could probably say, I have lateral movement, or I have pivoting down from that layer 4 to that 3.5. And then maybe I have process manipulation from that engineering workstation or SIS controller. So you have a lot of different TTPs that you can now speak to when developing that CMF.
Yep, exactly. And logs are so very valuable. I covered a bit of this in the second webinar, but the other piece of advice I typically give clients is to always have something in your OT environment that is simply a canary or a honeypot. And the second that that device gets touched, then you know for certain that either somebody is doing something reckless that they shouldn't be doing, or there's a threat group in the environment. In any event, so let's pivot over into the physical logistics of OT in general. So when doing OTIR, always have an emergency command room or a collaboration space in order to house the entire team. Secondary to that, if an attacker has made it far enough into the OT network via IT, it's a pretty safe bet that your communications are also compromised. And so always have considerations taken for out-of-band communications. Always have an IR room with whiteboards. The reason for that, generally in an incident, there is a scribe. Now, the scribe may be the person jotting down information inside of a logbook and whatnot, but the rest of the team still needs to be able to, at a glance, see the current state of a situation. But of course, given the current climate and the way that the world works these days, also account for doing incident response in a virtual manner. So having either like some sort of video collaboration tool in place, having all of the contact details within your incident response plan current and up to date, considerations such as that.
Now, moving into equipment, obviously you want to have those network security monitoring tools, but ideally you want to have that already built CMF with that threat detection overlay in your grab bag. Now, in addition to a grab bag, you should want to include the necessary forensic tools to collect that volatile data. So that means hard drives, encrypted hard drives. Also, you want to have, what I recommend is pre-canned scripts to be able to collect all that forensic data. And one thing to kind of highlight here when we talk about IT and OT differences, generally IT, you'd say, okay, let me install an agent, let me scale my operations. With an OT, like we spoke before, you can't change that baseline of that SCADA system. You need to stick within scope or not install anything. So generally that results in scripts that can be ran from a drive that then will collect the forensic evidence so you can take it back and analyze it offline. Or you can throw it on online, but you definitely can't have an active connection to those systems to collect that data. In addition, you want to have these tools like that script I mentioned pre-approved and tested in the environment. So when you go into that environment anywhere that has the same system, you're staying within the vendor restrictions.
Yeah, exactly. And Vern mentioned it in the previous webinar. A lot of clients are very confident in their collection skills and capabilities until it actually comes under, duress and load. One final note about the write and scratch media: if you're using encrypted drives, you have to pre-encrypt in order to do it correctly. And so you might be spending a couple of hours while an incident is transpiring before that media is even usable. So preparation is key when preparing equipment in general. All right, so let's talk about personnel. Um, it's always about people, processes, and procedures. So define your incident response team. Make sure that you know exactly who is part of it. And this might also take into account people outside of the formal incident response team. For example, let's say that you have a network admin who happens to have malware as a hobby, for lack of a better term. But it's understanding all of the resources in your environment, because people might be doing things completely out of their wheelhouse from a professional perspective, but they might have unique skills and capabilities that can be leveraged during an incident. And, you know, define your incident command structure. So whenever an incident kicks off, there should be an incident commander by default. Doesn't necessarily have to be your CISO. It might be the security operations analyst that raised their hand and said, hey, there's something very strange happening here. Or it might be a site champion who noticed that their HMI wasn't working quite exactly as they were expecting. And that is the de facto incident commander, because ICS is the other ICS. In the States, they call it NIMS, which is the framework built by FEMA, where it's like whoever initially detects the incident is effectively the commander until otherwise. So, that being said, make sure that your teams have relevant training. So, safety training, training within the technology stack of your environment, site specific training, and of course, professional certifications related to incident management, handling, and the like. But most importantly, within OT, safety is key for everything. So make sure that you have the personal protective equipment, or PPE. Coming from my sector, hydrogen sulfide is or H2S is a very major consideration because of refinery operations. In other cases, you may need non-conductive composite-toed boots if you're in electrical. So considerations such as that. No, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so procedures, right? We want to talk about the technical procedures. Now, these can be these playbooks that you can attach as an appendix on your already existing IRP. And that's going to go over the forensic collection procedures, how to run that script that I mentioned before, kind of talk about those predefined containment strategies, as such as isolating this segment so it's not affecting the other business units or processes that are within my environment. How do you do a host isolation procedure? Is it simply unplugging that network cable, or is there another mechanism such as unplugging at the switch port level? So you definitely want to have these defined, and you want to follow that script and have it rinse and repeatable, because in incident response, the tension is very high, emotions are high. So you definitely want to be able to follow that script. And that's taking the time in that preparation phase to build out these procedures, test them, and get them pre-approved, and then definitely understand the authority to enact those containment strategies, because you definitely don't want to rely on heroics when it comes to implementing those. You definitely want to follow a certain org structure. Who has the official authority to say, yes, isolate this system? Maybe it's at the operator level, maybe it's at the plant supervisor level, because they have all the safety considerations that come with that system.
Yeah, fully agreed. And I can't emphasize point number one enough, because it's lost on a lot because it's an availability issue if there's ever an attack, but it's also a crime. And secondary to that, the OT containment procedure, I have seen over enthusiastic containment, which has led to loss of view. When loss of view occurs in plain English, that means that you can't control the system anymore. And so this might be because somebody shut off a switch, or did something quite drastic, and that led to a safety incident. And so over enthusiasm is just something that have another person look at the way that you're containing, point out any flaws um, that possibly in the heat of the moment weren't considered, and then contain accordingly. Okay, so let's talk about communications. In the previous webinar, we talked about a couple of case studies. The first was Colonial Pipeline. And just to very briefly summarize, Colonial Pipeline was an IT incident, but because Colonial couldn't speak confidently to the OT environment, in an air of caution, they did the right thing and they isolated their OT environment. Of course, that led to a few side effects and such with energy prices in general. Secondary to that, we also spoke about Norsk Hydro. And that, in my opinion, is the gold standard on how to handle an incident where they were plain, they were transparent, they went through their blockers, and pretty much like just hands open, kind of like, here's your information, and this is what's happening on an hour by hour basis. So, in terms of communicating effectively, the first thing that a lot of organizations struggle with is the use of jargon. And so plainly explaining concepts and terms in a way that's understandable and relatable, because not everybody knows what an SIS is or an HMI. And so plain English is always the first place to start. In the Hydro incident, they had an incident dashboard that was being communicated to their customers, where it was a very neat spreadsheet of the sites affected, their production levels, and where they were at, and which sites were affected worse than others. For example, their Portland site had an ERP there, and it was significantly affected. And so they actually went through great effort in order to say, this is the worst affected site. So that brings me to templates for incident reporting to external stakeholders. Hydro had excellent ones. And it was very clear that the way that they communicated led to almost no blowback whatsoever. And they also had a proper cadence for communications. Customers were told, you're going to get an update no matter what, every single hour, even if we have nothing to say. Excellent. And of course, knowing the intended audience, it was manufacturing. And so talking or being lost in the minutia of IT systems and all that sort of, items, they glossed over that because they knew their audience. They knew that it was manufacturing. They knew that people were waiting for things related to their supply chain. And of course, out-of-band communications. And I've already mentioned this once before, but I can't emphasize it enough. If an adversary has gotten into your OT environment, possibly via the IT environment, it's a safe bet to say that communications are compromised. So,
And one thing to note on communication as well, that common terminology, I typically see existing, companies taking their existing severity matrix to kind of add a column to that to show the operational impact. So everyone's working on the same subset of knowledge of,
yes.
okay, this is impacting my operations and I understand it, that this is the severity level.
Yep, exactly. So and I just brought up the example incident timeline. This is what communications typically should look like, where it's like, okay, problem statement on the left, information received, the time that we received it, the actions assigned, who exactly is owning it, the priority, and the action and result. This example very closely resembles what proper incident management should look like. So, to summarize, this is the final and third part of the three-part series for OT incident response. I thank everybody for taking the time to hear Noah and I, tell a couple of war stories and such. And I hope that we've imparted a decent level of knowledge in order to help you and your organization be empowered to respond to OT incidents specifically. So, additional resources. I'm a big fan of checklists. In the OT white paper, we have taken great care in order to create one that covers your facilities, your equipment, your personnel, your procedures, and your communications. And of course, Noah and I have spoken greatly about building out CMFs. And so we also have a workflow that you can employ within your organization in order to have the correct amount of information prepared before an incident happens over when one actually occurs. And so the summary is as follows. The key takeaways: always prepare ahead of a crisis. That is always the best approach to take. As far as your plant champions, your OT operators, those are utterly vital for incident response in specific. And of course, IT and OT are two separate business units. And the best way to respond to an incident is to make sure that there is cross collaboration. Because what we're seeing right now is a higher degree of OT and IT convergence. It used to be that OT systems were air quote air gapped. That is not the case anymore. And we're also starting to see more IoT devices involved within OT networks. So the takeaway here, kind of to drive it home, are the 5 controls for OT cybersecurity. If you implement those, then you're aligning to good practice. And so I strongly advise that, the link that is going to be dropped in the chat, take a look. It makes a lot of sense, especially from my viewpoint. So if you posed a question and we didn't get a chance to reply to it during the webinar, here are our email addresses. Feel free to send us a message, a note, whatever you see fit. And goodness heaven forbid that anything should happen. These are our urgent incident response numbers. So for North America and consequently all areas therein, and of course EU and the United Kingdom and Australia. Additionally, for the non-emergency requests, feel free to email us at irdragos.com. So thank you very much for your time. Noah, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar. I do see a couple questions in the chat. I don't know if we're saying if you wanted to answer them, or we could tackle those.
Certainly. So the first question, and I think I've covered it a little bit, is the differences between OT and IR, or sorry, OT and ITIR. And so I'll start off and I'll hand it over to you, Noah. It's mainly the presence of legacy systems. That's what I find quite a lot. I also find a lot of OT IT convergence. And as I mentioned earlier, approximately 70% of OT breaches come in via IT. Now, I've also seen other attacks related to, for example, USB sticks infected with malware. And we're also starting to see really interesting and novel concepts by threat actors using a lot of social engineering and the like. No?
Yeah, and to reference the, kind of how to use that IR checklist that we provided in that white paper appendice, ideally you want to take that IR checklist, right, as kind of a roadmap, kind of objectives, high level statements, map them to the considerations that you have for your environment, because not every OT environment is the same. Everyone is unique snowflakes. So you definitely want to incorporate those plant champions, incorporate the necessary teams on your side, develop best IR checklist procedures, and you want to make that as a tear-off sheet. You want to be able to rip that off and pin that on every single cubicle or every single wall in that plant, So you know that your OT operators and your IT staff are aware and so it's socialized in the event of an incident.
Yep. And Noah actually foreshadowed into our next question, which was why is an IR checklist specifically for OT important? Well, I mean, the easy answer is obviously it's a different environment and such, but it also plays into that. Um, I've seen it in instance before. There is an active incident. What does an operator first do? They turn it off and on again. Well, that's a very volatile device, and the logs suddenly vanish. So following the checklist in the order and taking into account the various dimensions that are completely different for OT. For example, you may need a very specialized cable in order to do a forensic collection on a certain device. You may need to have specific knowledge on how to access the device, the controller, the HMI, whatever. But the bottom line is that it is a different environment. And due to that, and due to the technology stack, my advice to my clients is to tailor our generic checklist into something that has a high level of specificity for your environment. No, any other thoughts?
No, you pretty much you said it beautifully. For that last question, kind of why an OT IRP is important, I really want to reference that Executive's Guide to OT Cyber Incident Response white paper. When looking at OT, you're dealing with more risk. You're dealing with human safety, loss of life, right? A machine is, doing things physically versus like an IT system that's sending emails, right? It's different risks. So you definitely want to have different procedures and different insights built into a separate plan that you're going to follow and that they, of course, OT operators, the plant supervisors and IT people are working in the OT are well aware of those procedures. And additionally, you can have people that you need to bring into your operations to assist with incident efforts be onboarded correctly to the things that are happening within your environment.
Yeah, exactly. And because OT is so different, having proper awareness campaigns where, for example, like I've come across incidents where an HMI has just started to act really, really strange. How is it doing that? Well, I see a mouse cursor moving, for example. And of course, through proper awareness, the operator reported it, and it turned out that it was a threat group. And so we kicked off an incident. And so seeing things that are a marked departure from the norm in an OT environment, that's a really important educational component to make sure that is present in your awareness campaigns. Because stuff that happens in IT environments versus OT, they're very, very different. And as part of the difference, you have to make sure that your operators are educated in order to detect a marked departure from the norm. In any event, that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. And so we're more than happy to take take questions from the chat, any additional ones. And of course, you have my email address, you have Noah's email address. So if you wish, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to assist. Noah, any closeout thoughts?
No, once again, I want to thank you for your time and hope we can answer all your questions in the chat. Thank you.